Hello guys, Art-Teeves here. In this video, I'll show you the process of modeling, lazy UV unwrapping and texturing this stylized barrel spaceship in 3ds Max 2024, Rizom UV and Substance Painter. Let's get started. As always, I'll walk you through my entire pipeline in this video, from modeling to unwrapping and texturing. But before we dive in, a quick word about this spaceship. I built a similar model before as a rough concept, where I didn't bother optimizing anything, resulting in over 50k polygons without interiors or clean topology. The version you see here stays under 10.3k polygons. Of course, we could optimize it further, and I'll share a couple of ways to do that. This tutorial shall be especially helpful for beginner 3ds Max users struggling to connect different cylinders. I've kept the whole pipeline intact and sped up the footage 4 times. You can always slow it down in YouTube settings if needed. Since the ship is mostly symmetrical, I cut out some repetitive sections of the video. The ship is assembled from rounded barrel-like shapes, but I merged everything into a single object, except for the moving parts like propellers and landing legs, which retract into the hull during takeoff. For texturing, I used a lazily made 4K Reso UV map with a 32 pixel padding, mostly for demo purposes. We could easily scale it down to 2K. Someday I'd love to revisit this ship, give it more personality, and add a crazy pilot poking out from the top hatch, maybe shaking his fist at onlookers. He'd probably have controls wired to a gamepad mounted on the ship's roof. For modeling, I relied on the loop regularizer. You could swap it for rapid tools instead. I unwrapped my model in Rizom UV. Any software you like works fine, except maybe stock 3ds Max, which isn't great for unwrapping without paid plugins. Why Rizom? I love its straightening algorithm and tools for stacking similar elements on top of each other. I skipped the classic high poly to low poly baking method. Ideally, with no interior geometry, this isn't a hero asset, so we could halve the poly count and just paint or sculpt details, and then bake them in. That said, in indie games, model like this can work fine, depending on the scene and object purpose. The stylization comes from combining basic smart materials in Substance Painter with the stylized tool. By the way, if you enjoyed my content, be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized tutorials. The central cylinder has 36 sides. We could have used fewer, but I figured 12 segments per side is solid. Either way, for symmetrical engines spaced 120 degrees apart, we need sides divisible by 3. The side engines and leg holders got 18 sides, probably overkill. The holders could have been 10 to 12 sides, and turbines 12 to 16 sides, but it is what it is. If we wanted to optimize further from here, we could remove painted rivets, sculpt them in ZBrush or Blender, then manually retopologize the whole ship and bake the high poly onto it. That would cut polys by at least a third, maybe half. Modeling objects like this ship involves some pre-planning. Position the first turbine so its outer edge aligns with the main hull's outer edge, which will let you edit these elements conveniently in word coordinates. Overall, the design is super simple, so we can model just a third of the ship, then copy and rotate duplicates 120 degrees once we are happy with their appearance. This applies to turbines and leg holders. For the stylized look, we break symmetry with bent stairs and curved top railing. Why model it all as one object? Many renderers and game engines handle modular geometry just fine. We could have left railings and stairs separate. Still, I prefer merging them, partly out of habit. The method has some downsides. For example, our railing may dent the hull plating. In case of this spaceship, that's a plus. We want a battered, worn appearance. Most connections use 8 sides for easy attachment. Just select a vertex, chamfer it, tessellate the resulting face, delete it, and regularize the edges. This gives a clean octagonal joint, way tidier than using Propellers. I also surround side connections with circular loops of near-square polygons to improve shading. The downside of this method, its sides might be excessive sometimes. For low poly trees or flowers, stick to 5 sides max, using intersecting separate pieces instead. I manually adjust some vertices to avoid distorting the ship's hull geometry when applying regular eyes. The resulting circles might not be perfectly round at first, but once I extrude them from the hull, I flatten the faces along the local axis to make them truly planar, then reapply regular eyes. I also add a single chamfer to the corresponding joints. As I mentioned earlier, it's best to surround each cylinder connection with a ring of near square polygons. This yields excellent topology overall. I repeat the same process to form the two connections between the hull and the first turbine. I also nudge the surrounding vertices to make the resulting topology as organic and smooth as possible. Next, I detach the engine and its connections from the hull, ensure their pivot point aligns exactly with the ship's pivot, centered precisely on the vessel, not some midpoint, and rotate the assembly 120 degrees, adding 2 copies and attaching everything back to the hull. Overall, we could have saved this step for the very end. Finally, I attach everything together and ensure there are no open edges remaining. Next up, shaping the leg modules. As I mentioned, I made a bit of a mistake here. Gave them an excessive 18 sides when 10 to 12 would have sufficed. Their tops ended up streamlined. Again, a single chamfer could have done the trick instead of a double. With the ship's symmetry, every extra polygon gets multiplied by 3. When positioning the first leg, keep the turbines in mind so the leg slots right between them. That way, all external elements are spaced at 60-degree angles. That said, you could eyeball it. Our ship has a quirky look, and a few editors won't hurt. Unlike the turbines, the leg models attach at a slight angle to the hull. I think I used 10 degrees. Memorize that number. It will come in handy when reassigning pivot points for moving parts like the landing struts. Ideally, the leg model's outer edge should face directly toward the hull outer edge. The hull's 36 sides make this possible since they are divisible by 6, and you can rotate the leg as needed. When cutting holes in cylinder sides, avoid letting their corners stretch too far towards the rectangle's distant edges. Always add extra supporting edge loops to keep polygons close to square shapes. As with the hull and turbines, I give most hard edges a single chamfer. Then I shape the central module, attach the leg to it, and copy the whole thing, plus surrounding polygons 3 times, rotating copies 112 degrees. Each side has 6 faces, totaling 18 at the ship's base, conveniently half of the hull's 36 sides. My main slip up here, excess poly count. Manual retopology would have helped optimize, or we could have baked high poly models onto 10-sided versions. I modeled the modules as closed objects where the landing struts will retract later. Plan strut lengths so they don't protrude too much, and hole widths to fit the struts snugly. Nothing stops us from reducing the leg model's sides to 10, or even the central one, and skipping the merge, just letting objects intersect. That said, I'd save this technique for far more complex assets with widely different geometry where it's truly needed. Overall, 8 sides work just great for such connectors. In hindsight, we could have used the same method for the joints and added cables linking the side modules to the main hull. Remember to consider the level of detail. Curved cables bring tons of extra geometry, just like the springs at our leg spaces. Plus, intricate small elements clash with simple cartoonish, almost caricature-like forms. If this were a hero asset, say a ship the hero uses to travel between game levels, and as a base, that's where character and deep detailing shine. We'd probably add a sort of a chunk in the central model as well. Next I align the central leg module to the main hull, the way their centers belong to the same vertical line. In order to create a smooth transition from 36 to 18 sides on a flat surface, I select and collapse every other edge of the main module. Then I attach and bridge 2 pieces together. Finally, I give the lower model's top and bottom edges a single chamfer. The landing legs are the most debatable part of the ship. Each leg, including the spring, eats up to 500 polygons and double that in trees. The base and top of each leg got 12 sides, which is fine considering the excess in the elements above. It's key to think about viewing angles. If we watch the spaceship from above, we could slash leg polys even more. If the hero approaches from below, the underside geometry matters extra. The springs have 6 sides. That said, if prepping for animation, I'd model springs differently. Just last week I recorded a video on that, including spring animation. For this ship, it's a static prop, not a hero asset. Either way, adding springs is a big decision. If they don't boost your model's charisma, skip bendy cables and curved details. Baking them onto a cylinder rarely looks decent. I merged the springs with the rest of the leg geometry, then rotated the legs at the same angle to the ship as the leg models. The leg bottoms are hemispheres from spheres with 12 segments, crucial if viewed from below. The soles got single chamfers, like all other tech elements. The legs stay unattached to the ship. We want them retractable into the leg modules for taking off or landing. The cavity at the foot's top is probably unnecessary. We could have painted it like the big flat rivets. In short, for this ship, the landing struts are a huge poly-saving opportunity. We could have cut more by shortening springs and reducing the amount of coils. If you've forgotten the angle for rotating your leg modules, simply move the leg's pivot point to the center of its very top, then use vertex snapping along with the Select and Place tool to position it accurately. Sometimes it might flip. In that case, switch to the local coordinates and rotate the object 180 degrees. The feet of the landing legs were shaped to prevent tilting and ensure they adapt to flat surfaces. If this were a hero asset, I'd keep them as separate objects, so they could conform to whatever terrain the ship lands on. If we're using multiple intersecting objects, we want to avoid vertices sitting too close together, or different pieces sharing exact planes. These can trigger Z-fighting. To prevent it, ensure your objects intersect each other cleanly and solidly. The ladder is another debatable design element. I realized that without hatches on the ship's underside, it's hard to imagine how the pilot gets in. So I added an awkward ladder. The pilot would have to pull himself up to the bottom step. When creating models like this one, it's easiest with a character reference. You can then scale everything to his height and limb lengths. Don't eyeball it, especially if you are inexperienced. Remaking later isn't fun. I wanted to attach the ladder to the rest of the model like everything else. The simplest way would have been to hang it on the side intersecting the walls. That could have cut support pulleys, say 6 sides instead of 8. I chose 8 to match the vertices around the holes. Octagons attach far easier to cylinders or any other surfaces than odd combos. I didn't want excessive symmetry, broke it with bent steps and a curved top handrail. I was lucky this time. The main cylinder's side count let me align supports to vertices using my earlier chamfer method. To cut step pulleys, I'd use octagons at attachments, then transition to hexagons where a couple of triangles on flat planes. Triangles are fine where they don't mess shading or hit animated areas, otherwise artifacts show. No LED workflow here, so triangles work, especially on flats. I angled the steps to the hull and each other, denting them for a damaged used wipe. As always, I ringed cylinder intersections with near square pulleys for better shading. Of course, for savings, we'd drop steps to 6 sides and keep the ladder separate, unattached. Same method attached the lower ladder to the main module's base. I skipped ringing step intersections, figuring metal flows add character to our beat-up ship. When I saw the lower ladder came out too short, I simply detached its bottom section, duplicated it, attached the copy to the base, and merged everything into a single object. Later, I added more dents to the ladder for that extra battered feel. I moved the step elements around after switching to local coordinates. I wanted to make them look as garage-made as possible. Looking back, I could have cut some polygons, especially the brackets protruding from the hull. Instead, welding seams could have been painted via textures. How vertices get shifted with edge constraint enabled. Surprisingly, it's the latter, its steps and railings, that truly define the ship's final look and style. Sure, the bloated, cartoonish turbines contribute, but the real character comes from these decorative bits. I deliberately skipped portholes to keep an industrial vibe. That means letters shouldn't be straight or symmetrical. It'd make the design too rigid and strip away the charm. I even tweaked the angles of the lower letters guides to echo the hull's curve beneath. I flip between word and local coordinates now and then to nudge letter parts. At this stage, you are shaping the model's personality, so take your time, I recommend it. I also varied the rail heights. Maybe I should have pushed further, like having a rusty bottom step dangling from just one torn guide. Like other steps, the letter's mounts get a single chamfer. Check your steps, not all need multiple supporting edge loops. Where one loop defines the shape, stick to that. I gave the lower rail sections a single chamfer, probably should have skipped it for something bolder, like the hanging step I mentioned. I attached the ladder supports and individual steps to the ship's hull using a mix of attach and breach tools. We don't always get perfect joints, so nudge the resulting faces by switching to local coordinates, rotating and moving them as needed. This goes for all steps. We can experiment with the railing by mixing different attachments for the ladder. It all comes down to your imagination, and whether you are building a generic prop or a hero asset for a specific game. Back to optimization. Of course, if you need to cut poly count, keep letters as separate objects intersecting the ship's geometry. Reduce sides on steps and rails, say to 6. Review them. Their bends likely waste polys, so trim supporting edge loops. Like the steps, the top railing defines our ship's character. Unlike tech systems and turbines, it reveals personality through bends, dents and that garage-made vibe. I start the railing cylinder from a spline with 36 elements, created via create shape from selection on one of the ship's top edge loops. I gave it 8 sides, matching its supports for easy attachment to the octagonal roof holes. I avoided perfect symmetry. You can space supports unevenly too. Supports come from cylinders placed in hole centers using select and place. Their curves form with a bend tool. I ensure each intersects the railing cylinder, then merge via Propellers. I didn't fuss over perfect joints, no rings of near square polygons here. We avoid artifacts, but imperfections add to the bettered look. Plus we can mask bumps with painted weld seams if desired. Overall, planing textures speeds modeling. It's always better to pre-plan what you model, bake or paint in Substance Painter upfront. Of course, it's only a good idea if the planing bureaucracy doesn't block your creativity. I cut repetitive footage of attaching each segment, they're identical to what I kept. To link the railing to the ship near the ladder edges, I used splines connecting open railing segment centers to attachment hole centers. Then I added new vertices to those splines forming their trajectories, and then I switched them to smooth mode. Next I thinned down the count of supporting edge loops to keep the curve smooth while ditching excess geometry. All hull holes used the chamfer method as always, otherwise I'd drop the side count of supports and the railing itself to 6. Again, if the model will be viewed from the hatch or from above in some kind of a top-down game, we shall cut landing gear details and boost the details of the top of the ship, like adding hatch hinges or a couple antennas. The fade-outs you see in this part of the video are explained by me doing repetitive things. I only cut out repeating stuff I did like a few seconds ago. Once the railing is done, I add the ship's hatch. As I mentioned earlier, I'd love to revisit the model someday with proper manual retopology, unless by then some AI nails high-quality retopper, and include an interior, like a cockpit, and inner ladder leading to the open hatch, with a pilot standing there shaking a fist at onlookers. I don't place the hedge dead center. Ideally, it opens on the side opposite the ladder, so a climbing character can slip right in without circling the lid. We're not centered, same reason as before, we are breaking symmetry to the max, even if technical elements stay symmetrical. For now, these details don't matter, our hedge doesn't open and lacks hinges. For the same reason, its valve isn't a separate object, but part of the ship's geometry. If modeling this is a hero asset, I'd make the valve separate, letting the character spin it, or having it rotate during opening. Speaking of a hero asset, I'd craft an interior and use different versions for internal and external scenes. The pilot could climb into a simplified low-poly cockpit, but camera switches would reveal a detailed set with high-quality props. No way I'd give the hedge 36 sides unless aiming for a semi-realistic model. Since the ship's top is flat, we can select every other edge and collapse to 18 sides. Still a lot, but I stopped there. The valve got 12 sides, perfect, since it divides by both 3 and 4, making support placement easy. I decided to round the hedge, as if someone last minute cared about our flying barrel's aerodynamics. Why not? I like that the hedge is offset relative to the ladder, not turbine or leg. It adds another dimension to our model. All triangles from transitioning 36 to 18 and then 12 sides sit on flat surfaces that won't deform in theoretical animation, so they don't cause issues. When modeling the hedge or its valve, consider if this is a hero asset and the character will frequently open and close it, or if we will often view it from above, make the valve and the hedge as detailed as possible. Remember, stylized cartoony models don't play well with tiny details. Valves and levers should be large and slightly exaggerated for that caricatured look. The propellers won't steal the spotlight, so we can skimp a bit on their poly count. I used inset to form the blade mounts on the main propeller, which slightly messed up the shading. No big deal, nobody's inspecting the blades up close or at odd angles. For a hero asset, we'd take a different approach entirely. Also consider, what if the propellers are only seen spinning? Then we could simplify their detail even further. Like the retractable landing legs, I kept the propellers as separate elements unattached to the main ship. I want them to rotate. I gave the main cylinder 10 sides, each with its own blade. I could have used fewer blades, but I wanted them small enough to avoid looking oversized while covering most of the turbine's inner geometry, since there's nothing inside. Naturally, the propeller centers must align perfectly with the turbine centers. Like other symmetrical elements, I first shaped the single propeller blade. I gave it a single chamfer, consistent with previous technical parts. We could have saved a few pulleys by skipping the chamfer. Then I detached the blade from the main cylinder and copied it 9 times, rotating each copy 36 degrees. Finally, I sorted out the propeller's smoothing groups and used the vertex snapping mode to position it into its place. You don't want the propeller's bottom to share the same plane with the turbine's bottom, so I made them intersect each other properly. The next part is universal, so I'll repeat most of the things I've mentioned in my previous videos. When it comes to final adjustments and checks, I save my model, reset its pivot point, scale, rotation and X-form, set the pivot point to the bottom of the middle part, and place it to 000 seam coordinates. Then I use the selection panel to scan my meshes for remaining angons. Technically, you can also remove poles and make sure there aren't many vertices that connect 6 or more edges. Next, I use the 3ds Max's XU tool to scan my model for some overlapping or isolated vertices and open edges. I had some isolated vertices, so I made 3 boxes, gave them proper names, attached each of them to corresponding propellers, and then deleted the boxes I've added. In most cases, this method fixes the bug. Finally, I proceed to assign my smoothing groups. There's nothing special about it, but once you are done, you can also apply the weighted normals modifier to your model. Just make sure to set smoothing groups meticulously, and mind that they will impact unwrapping. Normally, hard edges require corresponding UV splits for padding, but UV splits do not require hard edges. It's generally considered best practice to strategically pair and place hard edges and UV seams along natural breaks and shapes. My model doesn't have any transparent elements, so I've unwrapped it to a single 4K Reso UV map with a pixel padding of 32. That's pretty generous for this kind of a prop, especially considering the fact we use normals but don't bake anything. We can easily scale it down to 2K Reso. My model is relatively simple, so I've split my UVs according to existing hard edges and added some seams manually. Next, I simply exploded all cylinders and straightened everything I could straighten in Rizom. Any wires or tubes shall be straightened to receive some kind of stripes texture. At some point, we want to normalize our UV chucks and rescale some of them manually, considering their proportions in comparison to the proportions of neighboring elements. I perform manual scaling to allocate more texture space to visually prominent elements. Conversely, I reduce the size of UV chucks that will be obscured or less visible during typical use. When adjusting UV island sizes, make sure to maintain relative proportions within the same object. It's generally good practice to keep UV size variations within 20% of neighboring elements. Always scale UV islands uniformly per element. Any uneven scaling will create visible seams the Substance Painter can't fix, no matter what tricks you try. After placing all UV seams, I simply relax elements and position them horizontally or vertically depending on their locations. I mostly rely on Rizom's Optimize tool, O hotkey, and also its straightening algorithm. The other hotkeys I use are C for cut, W for weld, and Alt+G for stack similar UV chucks. Strategic UV seam placement is key. We can either position them along accessible edges for easy Substance Painter repairs with the Clone Stamp tool, or hide them in less visible areas. As an added solution, switching to triplanar projection in Substance Painter typically makes most seams disappear completely. The 32 pixel padding is serious business. We need to stack many small similar elements so their texture padding doesn't eat up the entire UV map. Plus, we want to enlarge UV chucks for elements we prioritize for detailing. For instance, if we want graffiti or stickers on the ship, scale up those UV chucks to keep the image crisp. Hidden parts like turbine interiors or engine cavities should shrink instead. Remember, stacked UVs share everything painted on them. You might want to create multiple stacks for propeller blades. Their backs can repeat, but fronts may want to get some variety. You may have noticed I placed most added seams on less visible sides of the model. During texturing, I covered most with the Clone Stamp tool and switched the projection method for most materials and masks to triplanar. I didn't fine-tune the UV unwrap further, since it's used the simplified modeling process. For a hero asset or semi-realistic model, we'd need a more meticulous approach. I could have stacked more elements, but chose not to for extra variety. Honestly, nothing stopped me from stacking UVs for all turbines, leg modules and legs. They're angled 120 degrees apart, making it hard to see them all at once. I went for the laziest option. Used LG combo to stack most repeating elements, but not key ones like the turbines. Again, pre-planning is crucial. If we knew we would view the ship from above, we could stack UV chucks for its bottom elements. Conversely, if viewed from below, we'd detail the underside and skimp a bit on the top. We can easily mix repeating and unique elements to throw viewers off balance. Finally, for extreme optimization, we could stack not just elements, but say cylinder segments. I took a lazy approach here. Overall, you can experiment with textures at this stage and see how the model bakes in Substance Painter. By applying a smart material, you get a sense of how it will look during texturing, and can keep unique UV chucks for elements that shape its final appearance. When baking my model, I set the highest possible amount of raise on all tabs, disabled the ID section, and switched my subsampling to 16. I've also made sure there were no purple lines on my model or some red fragments. Also, I've selected the option to use my low poly model as a high poly one during baking. I settled on a two-tone scheme of pale yellow and light blue. You can use an existing palette, borrow colors from a reference, or rely on your own if you have one. I worked without a ref, starting with a rough color blockout, then tweaking hues while checking them from different angles and under varied lighting. I began with a steel-painted cheap Dirty Smart material as a base. By the way, if you are worried about missing an element during texturing, apply a universal material without a mask, then paint over sections for other parts as needed. The model's key details come from the stylization tool. Everything else I do is just prep for it. That's why the process might seem basic. There is no need to layer complex artistic grunges with another filter. I organized several folders with my base material, one for blue elements, another for yellow, and the third for the red valve, and fourth for the landing leg feet. Whatever materials or masks you use, switch their projection method to triplanar. It helps hide UV seams in some areas. For seams that won't budge, paint them out before adding details. Create a paint layer, set all blending options to pass through, and use the clone stamp tool to cover visible seams. You can tweak the cover layer's opacity and brush flow for better control. Seams between yellow and blue leg model sections are drawn with the follow along pass tool, peeling back a mask on a rusty metal layer with a low height value added. As for rivets, I wanted them flat for some reason. To make them round, we'd need a brush with a gradient, or for a cooler effect, add rivets in ZBrush and bake them onto the low poly model. I made rivets by copying the steel layer used for steps, adding a black mask, then a paint layer, and using the follow along pass tool to draw rows of rivet circles. I adjusted spacing and brush size to keep them evenly spaced. Always block out colors first and finalize them only after seeing a reference image, a pre-made palette, or your model as a whole. It's easier than matching colors one by one. I cut video parts where I picked colors. It took ages. For beginners, dark and muted colors are easier to handle than bright ones, which require careful selection. My folders were set up as follows. I created a folder with a material that fills the corresponding layer. The folder received a black mask, and then I used UV chunk fill to apply it to relevant elements. Overall, I duplicated the initial folder multiple times, applying it to the elements I wanted to texture. Make sure to periodically switch environment and lighting settings to see how your model performs under different conditions. In other words, my work at this stage had two phases. First, turning the model into a color blockout, then tweaking colors until I liked the result. So I focus on masks, grunges and fill layers, whose colors I can adjust anytime. Similarly, I can edit follow along pass paintings at any point, tweaking the brush, its size, spacing and other settings. I didn't want tiny rivets, large ones suit our slightly cartoonish style best. Before I proceed to stylization tool, I apply the dripping rust generator and a basic rust material to the main hull and turbines, and another rust material that becomes a ground gradient and receives a blur slope filter, in order to look like some chipped paint in the bottom of our ship. I play with rust for some time, only applying it to certain elements of my model. Also I added its color, because I don't want it to be too bright. I have two different rust grunges on my model. One rust drips from the top of the ship, while the other one rises from the bottom side. Finally, I applied the stylization tool to some folders and slightly increased the number of brush strokes. I used the steel-painted Stay Smart material for propeller blades. Also, I give them some kind of edge highlights using the fill layer that has Grunge Scratches Dusty applied to it. I think this covers everything I wanted to mention. Thanks for watching, guys. If my videos are of use to you, be my guest and subscribe to my channel for more stylized content. And most importantly, have a great day.